Welcome back to Dead Reckoning, the Human Life Expectancy channel. In our quest to estimate how human life expectancy might change going forward, we're in the midst of our series of videos on things that might slow the advancement of new life-extending technologies. Having shown that new ways to die will arise, but are likely to be small compared to the lives saved, having shown that resistance to technology is to be expected, and having shown that advancing human reproduction and genetic engineering both have strong ethical support, in this video we summarize the regulations that currently limit some new life-extending technologies. While the regulation of autonomous vehicles, mobile digital medical information, personal sensors, nanotechnology, bionics, and other new technologies are worthy topics to explore, the technologies that have the greatest potential to extend human life expectancy while attracting regulation are those that involve genetic engineering. So we'll focus on those in this video. You should care about the appropriate regulation of genetic engineering. As we saw in our New Ways to Die video, regulations can help to prevent the development of biological weapons of mass destruction. They can also ensure that medical procedures using genetic engineering are safe and help to ensure that the rights of individuals are upheld and the interests of society at large are taken into account. Regulations can also accelerate appropriate uses of genetic engineering, saving and extending many lives. Recall that it was only after milk producers were required to pasteurize their milk, only after doctors were required to vaccinate and provide antibiotics for their patients, and only after municipalities were required to treat their water supplies that millions of lives were saved. How long will it be before regulations require that parents screen blastocysts for disease, or require doctors, based on evidence-based medicine, to use genetic engineering to cure diseases? So, what is the right balance for regulation of genetic engineering? The Dead Reckoning framework suggests that the potential harms that could be caused should be balanced against the potential increases in HLE, the quality of life, and other benefits. The challenge is that both could potentially be large for genetic engineering. On the downside, genetic engineering could lead to the proliferation of biological weapons of mass destruction, and patients and ecosystems could be harmed through insufficiently proven applications. On the upside, genetic engineering offers the prospect not only of eliminating genetic diseases that currently account for 2% of all deaths, but of making progress on curing communicable diseases, non-communicable diseases, and even aging, which currently kill 92% of humanity. Excessive regulation could stifle innovation and slow the implementation of advances that could improve and extend the lives of billions. So can the scientific and medical community that's involved in genetic technologies regulate itself? Probably not. The fact that genetic engineering has the potential to save and improve so many lives can provide an overwhelming incentive for people to use it. The risk, of course, is that they'll use it in ways that are not yet proven to be safe. One high-profile example of this was in 2019, when Dr. He Jiankui of the Southern University of Science and Technology in China was sentenced to 3 years imprisonment and 3 million renminbi fine for editing the genes of twin baby girls in an effort to ensure that they wouldn't contract AIDS from their father. To date, the babies have neither contracted AIDS nor suffered any abnormalities, but current medical and scientific protocols were breached. J. Robert Oppenheimer, one of the inventors of the atom bomb, has said, quote, "It's my judgment that in these things, that when you see something that is technologically sweet, you go ahead and do it, and you argue about what to do it only after you've had your technical success." That's the way it was with the atom bomb. I don't think anybody opposed making it. There were some debates about what to do with it after it was made. In a similar vein, 17th century mathematician, philosopher, and scientist Gottfried Leibniz wrote an early form of our technology evolves and cannot stop perspective. He wrote, quote, "Omne possibile exigit existere," which translates to, "everything that is possible demands to exist." Science historian Benjamin Herbert wrote, quote, "Science and technology often claim to be the servants of society, but they should take that promise seriously. Imagining what is right and appropriate for our world and what threatens its moral foundations is a task for democracy, not for science." More broadly, we can't have individuals, groups, or other countries individually deciding to make genetic changes to individuals and species that could infect the entire globe. The stakes for life on Earth are simply too high to leave effective regulation to any single group. Instead, we must ensure effective communication between doctors, scientists at the population and legislatures, and engage in dead reckoning analysis of the potential costs and benefits to humanity to protect and help as many people as possible to live as long as possible, as soon as possible. Of course, you can and should judge for yourself whether certain uses of genetic engineering should or should not be regulated. Our purpose here is to better inform and enable you to contribute to these important conversations. In that spirit, let's explore the regulation of genetic engineering. Since the need for regulation of genetic engineering varies according to whose genes are being read and altered, this video will summarize current regulations for plants, animals, and humans. Let's start with plants. What regulations guide the genetic engineering of plants? In our video, Is Evolution Evolving?, we showed that over the last 23,000 years, humans' selective breeding has resulted in the dramatic beneficial volitional evolution of almost all domesticated crops. And in our genetic engineering and our new food technologies videos, we showed how genetically modified organisms, GMOs, have greatly increased the quantity and quality of food available to mankind, and that today there is scientific consensus that currently available food derived from GM crops poses no greater risk to human health than conventional food. Still, the legal and regulatory status of GM foods varies by country, with the most marked differences occurring between the US and Europe. Countries such as the United States, Canada, Lebanon, and Egypt use something called substantial equivalence as the starting point when assessing safety. This says that if a new food or food component is substantially equivalent to an existing one, it can be treated in the same manner with respect to safety. The thought is that it would be irrational to accept a change if it arose through traditional horticultural techniques, but to reject the same genetically indistinguishable change if it was created through genetic engineering. Other countries, such as those in the European Union, Brazil, and China, authorize GMO cultivation on a case-by-case basis. Many countries allow the import of GMO food products with authorization, but either do not allow its cultivation, as in Russia, Norway, and Israel, or have provisions for the cultivation, but no GM products are yet produced, as in Japan and South Korea. Most countries that do not allow for GMO cultivation do permit research, however. Will CRISPR and genetic engineering of plants trigger similar challenges as GMOs? There's reason to think that it will not. Author Kevin Davies points out, quote, CRISPR edits are not GMOs. Whereas CRISPR cuts the genome in a precise spot, it's the cell's natural DNA repair process that stitches the ends back together. The resulting mutation is no different than might arise using a chemical mutagen or X-rays or occur naturally. That's the enlightened verdict of the United States Department of Agriculture, the USDA, which decided to treat CRISPR edits no differently than other methods of mutagenesis. As one positive indication, in early 2020, the regulatory agencies of the United States, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the Philippines have all approved the use of biofortified golden rice, known as GR2E, which biosynthesizes vitamin A, potentially preventing blindness in many thousands of people that would otherwise suffer blindness from vitamin A deficiency. Let's now move on to animals. What regulations exist for genetic engineering of animals? Such regulations seek to reduce the risks of developing bioweapons, destroying species and ecosystems with gene drives, and protecting the rights of animals. As we mentioned in our New Ways to Die videos, regulations have been created to minimize the likelihood of the development of bioweapons. You can imagine an evil genetic engineer could potentially create a biological weapon of mass destruction by re-engineering the genes of naturally occurring bacteria, such as anthrax, and viruses, such as smallpox or Ebola, to make them either more transmissible, more deadly, or both. Minimizing this risk is a top priority for the regulation of genetic engineering. And global treaties and regulations have been put in place to prevent the development of biological weapons. Way back in 1925, after the atrocities of chemical and biological weapons used in World War I, countries in the League of Nations signed the Geneva Protocol, which prohibited use but not possession or development of chemicals and biological weapons. As of July 2020, 145 states have ratified, acceded to, or succeeded to the protocol. In 1972, the Biological and Toxins Weapons Convention, BWC, was established. It now commits 183 states to prohibit the development, production, and stockpiling of biological and toxin weapons. Permitted purposes under the BWC are defined as prophylactic, protective, or other peaceful purposes. However, the Convention has an absence of any formal verification regime to monitor compliance, which limits its effectiveness. Soon after the first genetically modified bacterium was generated by Herbert Boyer and Stanley Cohen in 1973, the National Academy of Science considered the potential to re-engineer bacteria and viruses to create biological weapons. And in 1974, it established the Committee on Recombinant DNA Molecules, which released a report titled Potential Biohazards on Recombinant DNA Molecules that called for a worldwide moratorium on experiments to create antibiotic-resistant bacterial strains and create DNA hybrids with cancer-causing animal viruses, both of which could potentially be weaponized. In 2014, the CDC issued a ban on creating lethal virus experiments, but in December of 2019, the CDC removed the ban. Labs in the U.S. became able to manufacture strains of influenza, SARS, and the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, MERS, so that scientists can understand how microbes work and help us prepare for the almost inevitable future outbreak of new diseases. Redundant safety and security levels make the risk of escape of these viruses small. Samuel Stanley, chairman of the National Science Advisory Board for Biosecurity, said that this work is necessary to stay one step ahead of terrorists and, quote, is key to global security. Even beyond regulations, many countries have large quantities of vaccines for many of the world's worst diseases, such as smallpox and anthrax. Many countries also have created agencies to monitor both man-made and naturally occurring diseases. For example, in the U.S., the National Notifiable Diseases Surveillance System at the Center for Disease Control helps public health to monitor, control, and prevent about 120 diseases, foodborne outbreaks such as E. coli, and non-infectious conditions such as lead poisoning. In addition, the National Center for Emerging and Zoonotic Infectious Diseases studies diseases caused by highly hazardous bacteria like anthrax and viruses like Ebola, and investigates unexplained illnesses and deaths and new ways to prevent naturally occurring infections that spread between animals and people. Together, these regulations make it illegal to develop genetically engineered bioweapons, make it difficult to obtain existing diseases such as anthrax that could be weaponized, increase the probability that we could quickly observe any such attack, and could vaccinate against them quickly if it did. Still, this is a risk that must be watched and managed closely, especially because bioterrorists are less likely to be bound by regulations. Gene drives have also attracted significant regulation. As a reminder, from our genetic engineering video, gene drives occur when genetic engineering is applied to eggs and sperm cells. When this is done, any changes propagate to future generations. Since no individual or country should have the ability to modify or even eliminate a species on its own, there's also a clear need for global regulations on genetic engineering of animal germline cells. However, this might be less of a problem than it first appears. First, for point of comparison, we humans have caused species with certain genetic profiles to become extinct. While this is not a shining example of our ethical behavior, we've clearly allowed it to happen, and this has to be regarded as a larger crime than merely changing their gene pool. Second, it requires generations for such genetic change to propagate through an entire population. While fruit flies can grow to adulthood in 1 to 2 weeks, humans can take 20 or more years per generation, with most animals falling somewhere in between. For humans and longer-lived species, this would also allow significant time to observe the change and take corrective actions. Third, scientists working on gene drives follow strict protocols that take extraordinary precautions to ensure that animals that have been altered this way are kept in strict laboratory environments. Fourth, many gene drives are designed to be self-extinguishing. For example, they require a specific protein that's not found in nature to be active. Still, many countries expressly outlaw the editing of germline cells and punish those who violate the law. These include Canada, France, Germany, Brazil, and Australia. Other countries like China, India, and Japan forbid it, but have not passed laws, making their guidelines unenforceable. In the U.S., there are no laws, but governmental agencies have spoken out against it, and FDA approval is currently required. Finally, there are regulations to protect the rights of animals. Today, there are only 6 approved categories of genetically engineered animals in the U.S. that we covered in our Applications of Genetic Engineering video. They are biomedical research, environmental monitoring, protein production, use for investigating and finding cures for diseases, product manufacture, and food quality. So now let's move on to regulations for genetic engineering of humans. The humans first perspective we covered in our ethical perspectives video suggests that regulations for applying genetic engineering to humans should be even more restrictive than regulations for plants or other animals. And they are. Regulations cover the safe use of genetic engineering in medicine, its application to human reproduction, and protecting genetic information. Genetic and epigenetic tests are regulated to ensure their results are applied appropriately in a medical setting. In the U.S., some direct-to-consumer tests are reviewed by the FDA, while others are not. In general, direct-to-consumer tests for non-medical, general wellness, or low-risk medical purposes are not reviewed by the FDA before they're offered. Direct-to-consumer tests for moderate to high-risk medical purposes, which may have a higher impact on medical care, are generally reviewed by the FDA to determine the validity of their tests. For example, the FDA has allowed 23andMe to provide a genetic test for prostate cancer. In addition, regulations are used to minimize the premature or incorrect application of genetic engineering in medicine. Editing the human genome is a new and quickly evolving science. How safe is it? The only sensible answer is that we can't know until each practice is subjected to appropriate scientific and medical reviews. Current regulations require that doctors and medical review boards carefully weigh the benefits and costs of genetic engineering for each patient. Doctors take the Hippocratic Oath, primum non nocere, first do no harm. While this doesn't guarantee that no mistakes will be made, it ensures that the patient's needs come first. In this sense, genetic engineering is no different than any other medical treatment. In addition, the scientific method, randomized controlled trials, RCTs, and other medical protocols are in place to test the efficacy and safety of genetic engineering applications. In the U.S., the regulation of genetic engineering is the responsibility of the FDA. However, the FDA is constrained to regulate treatments for diseases only. This leaves out anything used for enhancement purposes. As a result, untested and potentially harmful nutraceutical products go largely untested in the U.S. This could provide a potential loophole for genetic engineering applications to improve health and extend HLE, but we should work to make sure that doesn't happen. We'd all benefit from true fact-based research as to the efficacy of it and other technologies in extending human lifetimes. In addition, this impairs the ability to get funding to study the health impacts of enhancements from genetic engineering. That's why many doctors and researchers are now lobbying for aging to be declared a disease. They note that what's considered to be a disease versus normal is strongly influenced by historical context. In the past, the desire of slaves to be free, homosexuality, and masturbation have all been considered diseases, but thank goodness, no longer are. They also argue that it's inconsistent that progeria, which is a medical condition involving premature aging, is considered a disease, whereas the same condition occurring in a person over 80 is not. While some have considered aging a natural process, as we showed in our Is Evolution Evolving video, it's actually the consequence of evolutionary neglect, not evolutionary intent. If aging serves no purpose, then the notion of aging as a natural process might be mistaken, and the notion that it is a disease to be cured has even more merit. Other regulations for genetic engineering have evolved around the globe. In 1997, the Convention on Human Rights and Dignity with regard to biomedicine from the Council of Europe asserted that interventions aimed at modifying the human genome can only be undertaken for preventive, diagnostic, or therapeutic purposes and only if its aim is not to introduce any modifications in the genome of the descendants. However, in 2015, the Council of Europe clarified that these core principles were merely reference points for future debate. In 2012, the European Medicines Agency approved the first human gene therapy for use in the European Union. In November 2013, in a move that some thought was overly cautious and restrictive, the US FDA ordered 23andMe to stop providing health information from its genetic tests. In 2017, US researcher Richard Hines said, quote, "We've always said in the past that gene editing shouldn't be done, mostly because it couldn't be done safely. That's still true, but now it looks like it's going to be done safely soon." In August 2018, the FDA and National Institutes of Health jointly announced that they would significantly reduce the special oversight process for gene therapies because, quote, there's no longer sufficient evidence to claim that the risks of gene therapy are entirely unique and unpredictable, or that the field still requires special oversight that falls outside our existing framework for ensuring safety. In 2018, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration approved the first therapy for using RNA interference technology. Also, COVID has caused regulations to become more flexible and responsive. The pharmaceutical industry and regulatory agencies have collaborated closely during the pandemic to rapidly develop and deliver diagnostic tests, treatments, and vaccines at breakneck speeds. Key regulations in clinical trial study design and development and post-clinical trial regulatory submissions were relaxed to accelerate the development and the deployment of COVID vaccines, saving many thousands of people. Today, regulations and guidelines exist in 39 countries, and 29 have rules that could be interpreted as restricting genome editing for clinical use. However, many of the rules are ambiguous and not legally binding. They lack formal verification regimes to monitor compliance and, of course, cannot control bioterrorists or other parties that do not recognize them. While regulations are increasingly coordinated globally by the World Health Organization, the WHO, it also currently lacks the ability to enforce such regulations. Another important place for regulation is to protect the privacy of human genetic and epigenetic information. Even if you break no laws and believe you have nothing to hide, you should care about the privacy of your genetic information. If you've had your genomes read, individuals, businesses, or countries could potentially use that information in ways that could hurt you. However, future technological advances may make it all but impossible not to share your DNA. Now that DNA can be gathered from skin cells, coffee cups, and the recent discovery that it can even be pulled from the air, it will become increasingly difficult to keep from those who may want it. As a result, we suspect that it will become harder and harder to enforce any regulation limiting the use of genetic data. We'll address these issues in a future video. Realistically, there's only so much that regulations can do. Since genetic engineering would impact all life on Earth, regulations would need to be global to be effective. However, while the United Nations, World Trade Organization, and regional pacts such as NATO, the European Union, and Group of 20 exist, none has the ability to enforce global genetic engineering regulations. In addition, the many different cultures and interests that exist across countries make it unlikely that worldwide standards could be agreed anytime soon. In addition, since the incentives to use genetic engineering to enable and improve human reproduction and extend HLE will be large, and the tools and know-how needed to use it will be cheap and ubiquitous, we should expect that any restrictive regulations will be difficult to enforce and widely circumvented. Ultimately, we think it's unlikely that regulations that attempt to limit people's natural imperative to live longer, better lives could be enforced. As Stephen Hyman, former director of the President's Council of Bioethics, wrote, quote, "If we can find medications which enhance our performance, lengthen our life, decrease the stress, no regulation in the world would keep them from general use." People have always gone to great lengths, including traveling to other countries, to get medical treatments to improve their lives. Those with the means to do so will certainly seek genetic engineering wherever it's offered. As a result, the net impact of restrictive regulations would likely be to limit its use to only the wealthy and add risk to the procedures by making it difficult to regulate their safe use. As a result, regulations are more likely to delay the upsides of genetic engineering than protect us from the downsides. The doctors, scientists, and organizations involved in advancing genetic engineering largely do so in the public view and are beholden to public regulations. Whereas individuals and smaller organizations that could perpetrate nefarious or unproven uses of genetic engineering proceed far from the light of public scrutiny and could easily circumvent regulations. So, what's the proper use of regulations? Leveraging the Dead Reckoning framework, the risk of misusing genetic engineering should be balanced against the opportunity to save, extend, and improve the lives of patients. In our New Ways to Die video, we showed that the best information available today indicates that many more lives will likely be saved than lost. The current evidence is that the regulations that apply to new medical procedures will prove effective in minimizing the number of people that are harmed by inappropriate or premature application of genetic technologies. This suggests that the balance of regulation should be to accelerate, not limit, the use of genetic engineering. Humanity is now entering what we call its genetic adolescence. Genetic engineering and other life-extending technologies further expand our power of reproduction, allowing us greater freedom to choose who we and our children will be and what our species and other species shall become. These capabilities are every bit as wonderful, powerful, and intrinsic to humanity as the ability to reproduce itself. And, like reproductive capabilities associated with puberty, they cannot be stopped. We must come to terms with these new powers and figure out how to use them for individual and collective good. And the broad decentralized nature of this capability, as with the capability to reproduce itself, virtually guarantees that some mistakes of consequence will be made. While the analogy between human adolescence and genetic adolescence is imperfect, it actually may be helpful for gauging appropriate regulations going forward. For human adolescence, societies embrace the inevitability of sexual maturity and establish laws and regulations that set important boundaries that protect the rights of those who engage in sexual activity. These include age of consent, rape, child marriage, and abortion laws, among many, many others. We must now embrace the inevitability of genetic engineering's coming of age, mature rapidly, strive to uphold good ethics and morals, and imagine and enforce new laws and regulations to prevent the largest abuses. As with the laws of human reproduction, they will always be imperfect, hard to enforce, and will not help us avoid all problems, but are an important part of ensuring we use this new capability for maximal good. We join the chorus of others who have suggested that we should not hide behind the mistaken notion that genetic engineering can be stopped. Withholding or unnecessarily restricting the extraordinary benefits of genetic engineering from humanity would be the immoral equivalent of neutering our children before they come of age. As author and biomedical gerontologist Aubrey de Grey said in his 2005 TED Talk, quote, "Remember your sense of proportion. The question is, are the risks of doing something about aging so great that they outweigh the downside of doing the opposite, namely leaving aging as it is? Are these so bad that they outweigh condemning 100,000 people a day to an unnecessarily early death? If you haven't got an argument that that's strong, then just don't waste my time." Or, as cognitive psychologist Steven Pinker wrote, quote, "The primary moral goal for today's bioethics can be summarized in a single sentence: get out of the way." Seeking to stop the advance of genetic engineering and related life-extending technologies would not only be ineffective, it would postpone the time when we can use these technologies to save and improve thousands or even millions of lives and leave us unable to address the challenges that are clearly coming our way. As futurist and author Ramez Nam wrote, quote, "Now it's time to do what past generations have done for us, to explore the world, to experiment with new ways of doing and being so that we can pass what we learn on to the future, not to try to dictate the lives of future generations, but to let countless families and individuals chart their own course, apply their best judgments, and use our collective intelligence to propel our species into the future." So instead of wasting time and the folly of suppression, denial, and indecision, we must embrace the inevitability of the capabilities that genetic engineering will bring, undertake a fact-based communication effort that includes a dead reckoning analysis of the potential costs and benefits to humanity, and attempt to proceed with global regulations that attempt to help to protect as many people as possible as soon as possible. So, in sum, genetic engineering and the volitional evolution it allows properly belong among the 7 existential challenges facing humanity. We're going to have to come together and collectively decide what regulations and enforcement mechanisms are necessary. These regulations can, and in some cases should, slow certain areas of advancement in genetic engineering. But they should also accelerate its development and adoption to the benefit of all. The exact pace and types of regulation must be set collaboratively between scientists, politicians, business leaders, and everyday people. Our attempt here has been to engage you in this important conversation. In our next video, we'll bring it all together. We'll consider the advances from HLE from the technologies covered in our videos with green banners, and then consider the other factors that could delay or counteract increases in HLE, and show you how we came to our conclusion that HLE could well expand by 10 or more years in the next 20 years. In the meantime, please hit the like button below, subscribe to the Human Life Expectancy channel to make sure you don't miss our next videos, and post comments for the topics you'd like to have us cover. Thanks for joining us. Till next time, as we say at Human Life Expectancy Inc., Hi Hua! Do what you can to help yourself and help us all to live longer.